The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as Rachel Torres adjusted her scrubs in the St. Michael's ICU bathroom, the synthetic fabric settling against her shoulders like it always did. Just fabric. Just another uniform, this one with a name tag that said nothing true about who wore it. She pulled her dark hair back into a regulation bun, the kind no civilian recognized as military precision, and studied her reflection in the mirror. 38 years old. Hands steady as a surgeon's laser. Eyes that had seen things that didn't exist in textbooks. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a temp nurse filling a staffing shortage. Dead wrong. The assignment had come through the secure line 3 days ago. Operation Steel Angel. A Special Forces veteran named Marcus Webb lay in room for 12 of St. Michael's ICU in Savannah, Georgia, his chart showing minimal treatment progress despite 17 weeks of hospitalization. The Pentagon needed someone inside the hospital. Someone who could move through the medical world like she belonged there. Someone who wouldn't trigger the usual background checks that might alert certain people to her presence. Rachel had done worse things for less important reasons. She'd done worse things before breakfast. She left the bathroom and moved into the ICU proper, her shoes making soft whispers against the tile floor. The unit smell hit her first, that particular blend of antiseptic and machinery and something underneath that was just human suffering, deodorized and documented. It didn't bother her. The field hospital she'd run in the Hindu Kush had smelled like diesel and cordite and blood that wouldn't wash out of canvas. This was cleaner. This was civilized. The ICU stretched out in its usual morning rhythm. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical patterns. Heart monitors traced their electronic stories in blue lines and numbers. Nurses moved between rooms with the careful focus of people who understood that the margin between recovery and catastrophe was maybe 30 seconds wide. Rachel had understood that truth for a long time. She understood it in her hands, in her muscle memory, in the part of her that never quite left the combat hospital tent where she'd learned to do things that textbooks didn't cover. She picked up her assignment sheet from the main desk. For patients. Routine vitals every 2 hours. Nothing requiring intervention. Nothing requiring decisions. Just observation. Just presence. She was good at being present without being noticed. 12 years of deployments had taught her that skill. 3 tours in the Hindu Kush. 2 Purple Hearts she couldn't display anywhere people would see them. She'd learned to make herself invisible while moving through rooms where the invisible could kill you. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was room for 12. She stood in the ICU corridor for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to look tired, not long enough to look suspicious, and let her eyes find the glass-walled room at the far end of the unit. Marcus Webb lay in the hospital bed with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy like ammunition. His chart was there on the rolling stand outside his door, and Rachel knew without reading it what it would say. Minimal treatment progress. Consistent vital decline. The kind of trajectory that happened when a patient received minimal care despite weeks of hospitalization. He had dark hair like hers. Broad shoulders beneath the hospital gown. A face that carried the particular geometry of someone who'd survived things that shouldn't be survivable. She knew that face. She'd spent 3 months working beside that face in the dust and heat of Paktia province, 2015, both of them doing things that required steady hands and the kind of calm that only comes from understanding that panic kills faster than bullets. Marcus Webb had been the best combat medic in her unit. Maybe the best she'd ever worked with. He'd saved 47 soldiers in the field. She'd counted. She'd watched his hands move with the same precision she was watching them move now, and she'd thought at the time that his hands were the kind you wanted holding your life. Then a Taliban RPG had taken his hearing in a valley north of Asadabad. The same blast had shattered 3 of his vertebrae and marked him as someone whose useful military career had ended. He'd been medevac to Walter Reed. She'd heard he'd made it through rehabilitation. She'd heard he'd been discharged. She hadn't heard that he'd end up in St. Michael's ICU in Savannah receiving minimal care from a doctor who was billing phantom rehabilitation programs. That was the thing about assignments. They always meant something before you understood what they meant. Rachel moved past the nurse's station and began her morning charting routine. Chart vitals from the night shift. Note significant changes. Flag anything that required intervention. The work was automatic, the kind of work that let her attention drift while her hands did what they'd been trained to do. Her eyes tracked the morning rhythm of the ICU. The way the senior nurses moved with authority. The way the residents deferred to the attending physician. The way Dr. Mercer commanded the unit like someone who understood that power wasn't something you earned, it was something you took and held until someone stronger took it from you. She'd watched men like him in the military for years. Officers who confused rank with competence. Commanders who believed authority was a force that emanated from them rather than something that had to be earned by people choosing to follow. They were dangerous for a different reason than the competent ones. The competent ones you could predict. The ones like Dr. Mercer, the ones who believed their position made them untouchable, those were the ones who made mistakes that started with small corruptions and ended with federal charges. Dr. Mercer arrived for morning rounds at 6:24 a.m., and the ICU shifted its center of gravity toward him like a compass needle finding magnetic north. His shoes clicked against the linoleum. Expensive shoes. Italian leather. The kind of detail that meant something about how he saw himself in the world. His white coat was precisely pressed. His stethoscope hung with the kind of careful casualness that suggested he was aware of how it looked on him. He was a tall man, moving through his rounds like he was walking through a space that had been designed specifically for him to occupy. Rachel continued her charting. Patient for 12 was due for vitals. She'd make her rounds in rotation, the way a temp nurse should. Nothing special. Nothing that would draw attention. Just presence. Just observation. Just the way you did it when you needed to see what was happening without anyone noticing you were looking. But as she moved through the unit, something in her noticed the way Dr. Mercer spoke to the attending nurses. Dismissive. Brief. The kind of communication that wasn't information exchange but assertion of hierarchy. He moved to patient for 08, a post-surgical cardiac patient, and Rachel heard him ask about the overnight monitoring without actually looking at the nurse who answered. The question was directed downward, like he was asking a machine to confirm its own function. The nurse, whose name tag read Collins, answered with a kind of careful precision that came from understanding you were being tested rather than consulted. Dr. Mercer nodded once and moved to the next room without acknowledging the answer beyond that nod. He was a man who understood the architecture of power in ways that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with control. Rachel reached room for 12 and pulled up Marcus Wedd's vitals from the overnight monitor. His oxygen saturation had drifted down to 91%. His heart rate had climbed to 104. His blood pressure showed the kind of creeping instability that meant his body was working harder than it should be to maintain baseline function. The chart notes from night shift were minimal, patient stable. No interventions required. Sleeping. The kind of note that could mean anything from peaceful rest to dangerous oxygen depletion, depending on who was reading it. She entered the room quietly. Marcus was awake. His eyes tracked her movement with the focused attention of someone who had learned to see what hearing people missed. She held up her vital signs monitor and gestured to her purpose. Routine check. He nodded and extended his arm for the blood pressure cuff. She worked in silence, the way good medical professionals did. The cuff inflated and deflated. The pulse oximeter clipped onto his finger and began its electronic count of oxygen saturation. Her eyes didn't linger, but her hands noticed things. The way his breathing seemed to require effort. The faint tremor in his arm when he extended it. The tightness around his mouth that suggested pain being managed rather than eliminated. These were the things you noticed when you'd spent years watching wounded soldiers understand their own deterioration. When she finished, she wrote the numbers on his chart: BP 13687, HR 104, O2 SAT 91. All of them just on the edge of requiring intervention. All of them the kind of readings that meant something was wrong but not yet emergency level wrong. She signed her name, R. Torres, RN. The name was real. The credentials were legitimate. The reason she was here was classified. As she turned to leave, Marcus signed something. One hand moving with the fluid grace of ASL, American Sign Language. A question. She hesitated for exactly 1/10 of a second, then signed back, "I'm just the morning nurse. Vitals only." It was the correct answer. The answer a temp nurse would give. But Marcus's eyes changed when she signed. They sharpened. They widened just slightly. The look of someone who had recognized something they weren't supposed to recognize. She left the room without meeting his eyes again. The rest of her morning rounds passed in the careful rhythm of routine. Patient 407 needed pain medication. Patient for 09 was stable. Patient for 10 required a dressing change and showed signs of infection that the chart hadn't documented yet. Rachel made note of that. Made note of the way the night shift had been understaffed. Made note of the way Dr. Mercer would move through these rooms and make decisions based on incomplete information because he moved too fast to let accuracy slow him down. By 9:15 a.m. she had her full picture of the ICU, and by 9:44 a.m. she had her explanation for why Marcus Webb was deteriorating on a unit that was supposed to be treating him. The hospital was running lean. The attention was fractional. And something about Dr. Mercer's presence suggested he preferred it that way. Understaffed units were easier to manage. Fewer witnesses. Fewer people asking questions about treatment protocols and billing practices and why a Special Forces veteran who required intensive rehabilitation was instead receiving minimal care and sleeping medications that kept him sedated enough to not complain. She sat in the break room at 10:19 a.m. with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been warming since dawn. The coffee was barely warm. The break room was empty except for one resident who was eating yogurt and scrolling through his phone without interest. Rachel let her hands rest on the table in front of her. The hands that had held together 47 soldiers in the field. The hands that carried muscle memory from a decade of things that weren't in the curriculum. The hands that now held a medical assistant's pen and wore a hospital identification badge that explained nothing about who she actually was. The unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. Faded now, the way things faded when you carried them long enough. She'd stitched it there herself after her discharge, a reminder of something she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. The patch was the only proof she carried that any of it had been real. In room for 12, Marcus Webb was sleeping again, or being kept asleep, or understanding sleep as the safest place to be until something changed. She had 72 hours to understand why he was here. 72 hours to document what was happening. 72 hours before her assignment moved to the next phase, and everything that was currently invisible became something someone would have to answer for. She finished her coffee. It tasted like it had been made to be forgettable. She set the cup down and returned to the ICU, where the monitors kept their electronic count of human deterioration, and Dr. Mercer moved through his rounds like a man who had never been questioned in his life. What he didn't know was that his unquestioned authority was about to encounter something he couldn't dismiss with a smile or a title. What none of them knew was that the temp nurse adjusting vitals in the ICU was standing in room for 12 for a reason that had nothing to do with medical staffing and everything to do with the kind of loyalty that transcended discharge papers and civilian life. She had been given an assignment. She was going to see it through. And God help anyone standing between her and that outcome. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's ICU cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made human skin look like something freshly embalmed. Rachel stood at the medication cart, her fingers moving through the afternoon paperwork with the precision of someone who'd practiced the same task 10,000 times, when she heard Dr. Mercer's voice rise across the corridor like a conductor calling an orchestra to attention. "Grand rounds, people! Gather up!" The residents materialized first, 3 of them, fresh out of their second year, still moving with the uncertainty of men and women who hadn't yet learned that confidence was half the battle. Then came the attendings, 2 of them, senior physicians with the kind of posture that came from years of being right. Dr. Mercer stood in the center of the nurses' station, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested he was about to deliver something profound, something the younger staff needed to hear. Rachel kept working. Vital signs. Intake logs. The small mechanical work that kept the ICU breathing. You see this? Mercer gestured toward her without looking. This is what happens when we lower our hiring standards for temporary staffing. When we decide that credentials matter less than filling a schedule. The residents shifted. One of them looked at Rachel. Another suddenly became very interested in the floor tiles. A nurse who thinks reading WEBMD qualifies her to question treatment protocols. Who believes her gut feeling about a patient's care supersedes physician judgment. Mercer's voice had taken on that particular quality of contempt that only came from a man who'd never been on the receiving end of it. Tell me, Torres, did your nursing school teach you the difference between therapeutic intervention and playing hero, or did you skip that day? Rachel's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that if you were looking for it, you might catch it. Her fingers didn't pause on the keyboard. Her breathing didn't change. She reached for the next chart with the same mechanical motion she'd used for the previous one, and the one before that. The younger nurses at the station, Martinez and Chen, found suddenly pressing reasons to look away. One of them adjusted a monitor that didn't need adjusting. Mercer waited, as if expecting a response. When none came, he smiled. The smile of a man who'd won. He turned back to his residents, already moving on to the next teaching moment, the next opportunity to establish the natural hierarchy of a hospital where he occupied the top tier and everyone else occupied the tiers below. An hour later, Rachel stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. She'd needed to get away from the station, away from the weight of the eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers, away from the smell of the ICU, that particular combination of antiseptic and dying hope that stuck to your scrubs like a second skin. The vending machine hummed its mechanical song, the kind of sound that had probably been unchanged since 1987. Dr. Mercer appeared as if summoned by the universe's commitment to humiliation. He blocked her path, his body language suggesting this wasn't an accidental encounter. Behind him, 2 residents, the smirking one and another, waited like wolves that had caught the scent of blood. Can you even read these medication labels, Torres, or should we add remedial literacy training to your orientation? He tapped the glass display where aspirin bottles stood in neat rows. I'd hate for a patient to receive the wrong dosage because our temporary staff can't handle basic comprehension. One resident snickered. Not loudly. Just enough to be heard. Rachel inserted her dollar. The machine whirred. She made her selection, coffee, black, no sugar, and retrieved it from the dispensing slot. The cup was warm in her hands. She could feel the heat transferring through the cardboard sleeve, and she held onto that sensation, that small real thing in the middle of the performance. She walked past Mercer without a word. Her face was a mask. She'd learned to construct masks a long time ago, back when the cost of showing fear was measured in lives. Back when your composure was the only thing standing between your team and complete collapse. She'd gotten very good at it. So good that by the time she reached the elevators, no one could have known that her heart rate had climbed to 118 beats per minute. No one could have seen the calculation happening behind her eyes, the assessment, the threat evaluation, the decision-making process that had been hardwired into her nervous system by years of operating in environments where weakness was fatal. That afternoon, Rachel approached the billing records. She did it carefully, the way you approach a tripwire, slowly, methodically, aware that one wrong step could detonate everything. She submitted a formal request to Dr. Mercer for Marcus Webb's complete treatment history, including rehabilitation program documentation and equipment orders. The response came within 30 minutes. She found Mercer at the nurse's station, materializing beside her like something summoned from the walls of the hospital itself. Behind him walked a security guard, middle-aged, bored, the kind of man who'd taken the job because the pay was steady. Mercer's voice carried across the entire station, every word calibrated to be heard by every nurse, every tech, every person within earshot. I'm concerned about boundary violations, he announced to the charge nurse, Diane, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Torres has been exhibiting erratic behavior around the veteran patient in 412. Accessing records outside her assignment. making unusual inquiries about his rehabilitation program, asking questions that suggest she doesn't trust the treatment plan. Rachel turned to face him. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was level. The coffee she'd retrieved an hour earlier was growing cold on the desk beside her. These kinds of behavior patterns, Mercer continued, turning slightly so he could address both the charge nurse and Rachel simultaneously, often indicate someone who isn't suited for this environment. Someone whose judgment has been compromised by personal attachment or, frankly, lack of professional training. He stepped closer. Perhaps you need an escort off the premises to cool down, Torres. Think about whether this job is right for you. Whether you're really cut out for ICU nursing. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a threat. It was the casual exercise of institutional power, the kind of thing men like Mercer did before breakfast without considering the weight of it. Rachel nodded once. A single motion, her chin dropping and rising with the economy of a salute. Her face remained a mask. Then she stood, stepped away from the desk, and walked toward room for 12 without looking back. The security guard didn't follow her? Mercer had what he wanted, the message delivered, the power established, the hierarchy reinforced. Rachel's job was already compromised. In a few hours, he'd have her termination papers ready. In a day, she'd be gone. The temporary nurse who didn't know her place, who couldn't handle the structure of a real medical hierarchy, who'd made the mistake of asking questions. She reached Marcus's bedside and closed the door behind her. The room was dim, just the glow of monitors and the thin light that filtered through the privacy curtain. For the first time that day, Rachel allowed her hands to move without her conscious direction. They trembled as she adjusted his blanket, a small, unnecessary gesture, the kind of thing nurses did when they needed to do something, anything, to ground themselves in the moment. Her hands betrayed her. The trembling wasn't fear. She'd handled fear the way soldiers handle fear, acknowledged it, catalogued it, filed it away for later. This trembling was something different. This was the physical manifestation of restraint. The body's way of demanding release for the pressure she'd been holding. Marcus's eyes opened. He'd been sleeping, or pretending to sleep, the way long-term patients often did, half present, half absent, existing in that liminal space between consciousness and whatever respite they could find in medication-induced dreams. He watched her hands move across his blanket. He called me incompetent, Rachel said quietly. In front of half the ICU. Suggested my nursing school was a participation trophy. Marcus's eyes tracked her. He couldn't speak. The damage to his hearing had been comprehensive, a result of a cascade of blast pressure waves that had occurred in a canyon in Cuna province, but his eyes could speak volumes. His hands began to move, signing slowly so she could read his ASL. The question was simple, what do you need, I need to get you out of here before he kills you, Rachel said. Because that's what he's doing, isn't it? Not dramatically. Not with any hands-on action. Just slowly, systematically, underfunding your care and billing for treatments you never receive. She didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she checked his chart again. The pain management was minimal, orders for medications that should have been administered weren't documented in the nurse's notes. The physical therapy sessions that appeared in his billing records had no corresponding notes in his medical file. The nerve block procedures that showed up as line items in his account carried no anesthesia records, no procedure notes, nothing but the shadow of medical care. At 11 o'clock that night, Rachel sat in the break room with 3 pages of photocopied billing records spread across the Formica table in front of her. The room smelled like old coffee and the ghost of 1,000 employees' lunches. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song. She cross-referenced the supply orders with the actual inventory. $400 specialized wound care kits billed weekly for a patient with no open wounds. Physical therapy sessions charged at $200 per hour, scheduled according to the billing department but never appearing on the actual calendar. Equipment charges for devices she'd walked past the supply closet every day and never once seen in Marcus's room. The email chain was the smoking gun. She'd found it by luck, Mercer had left his office door open while he attended evening rounds, and she'd stood in that doorway for exactly 90 seconds, committing the details to memory. An exchange with a medical equipment supplier discussing our arrangement and maintaining current volume, and something called the finder's fee structure. The kind of language that translated clearly to anyone who understood what they were reading: kickbacks, inflated charges, and systematic theft. Rachel photographed 3 pages with her phone. Her hands didn't shake while she did it. Her heart rate remained steady. She was in her element now, in the space where information became intelligence, became action. She was no longer a temp nurse struggling to maintain her composure in the face of institutional contempt. She was something else entirely. Something that Mercer didn't have the framework to understand. She returned to Marcus's room just after midnight. He was awake, the kind of awake that suggested he hadn't been sleeping much, that pain and worry and the weight of being a prisoner in your own body had conspired to keep him conscious. She sat on the edge of his bed and signed slowly, deliberately, Hindu Kush. 2012, you remember. His eyes widened. His hands moved with a speed that suggested the memories were fresh, recent, as if 17 years hadn't passed since that afternoon in a canyon where Rachel Torres had become a legend and Marcus Webb had lost everything except his life. He signed back, Reaper. They sent me to watch over you, Rachel signed. Someone stealing your care. Someone stealing from you. His hands formed a question, who? Mercer, she said aloud, though she also signed it so he could see the word formed on her lips. Marcus's jaw tightened. His hands moved fast, too fast for her to catch every word, but the meaning was clear. Mercer had told him the pain was normal. That he was healing. That the minimal medications and the slow recovery trajectory was expected for someone with his injuries. Rachel checked his chart one more time. The night nurse, Rodriguez, thank God, someone good, had documented actual vitals, actual observations. But the pain management orders that should have been filled were absent from the administration log. Mercer's signature sat on orders for expensive nerve block procedures that had never happened. She stepped into the corridor and dialed her Pentagon liaison from her phone. The number was memorized. It was one of 3 numbers Rachel was allowed to call. One was the Pentagon. One was a burial detail. One was her son. We've got him, she said quietly, when the voice answered. You have documentation? Billing fraud. Kickback arrangements. Active harm to the patient. There was a pause. 3 seconds of static and the hum of a secure line. Not enough, the voice said. We need active harm. Intent. We need something that puts him in the category of premeditation, not just greed. Stay in position. Rachel closed her eyes. The hospital lights blurred. She had enough to arrest him. She had enough for civilian courts. But the Pentagon liaison needed something cleaner, something that put this in the category of not just theft but conspiracy. Not just incompetence but intent to harm a veteran under military protection. How long? She asked. As long as it takes. The line went dead. Rachel sat in her car in the parking lot, watching the hospital lights. The rain had started around 11, light at first, then heavier, then the kind of rain that sounded like applause against the windshield. She gripped the steering wheel and waited. She was very good at waiting. At 1:13 a.m., her phone buzzed. Not her Pentagon line. Her hospital notification system. Room for 12. Cardiac alarm. The fluorescent glow of the break room cast Rachel's shadow across the patient chart spread in front of her. 11:14 p.m. The night shift hummed around her, distant beeping, the hiss of ventilators, the soft pneumatic whoosh of automatic doors opening and closing down the corridor like the breathing of something alive. Most of the staff had retreated to their stations or the locker room. Rachel sat alone, her fingers tracing the timeline on Marcus's billing records. The discrepancies jumped out like red flags on a white field. Cardiac catheterization. Ordered July 14, billed to Serenity Springs Rehabilitation Program. Never performed. Physical therapy sessions. 5 sessions per week for 6 weeks. $240 per session. Billed. Never scheduled. She photographed each page with the burner phone her Pentagon liaison had provided, the clicks barely audible as they became digital evidence. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate. This wasn't administrative error. This was construction. Someone had built a perfect invisible pipeline from Marcus's insurance benefits straight into someone's pocket, and Dr. Mercer was holding the funnel. Rachel cross-referenced the supply orders against the billing records. A pattern emerged like a constellation forming from scattered stars. Phantom Rehabilitation Program, but the name was real enough. Serenity Springs Rehabilitation Center in Atlanta. Registered business. Licensed facility. And yet, she pulled up the facility's website on her phone, then cross-referenced it with the state licensing database. Licensed. Accredited. But something felt wrong. The physical address existed. But the staff roster didn't match any real names in the Georgia Nursing Board database. Every name was a ghost. The supply orders told the real story. Orthopedic equipment. Cardiac monitoring systems. Wound care supplies. Shipped to addresses that didn't exist or to storage facilities that listed no permanent tenants. But the invoices were real. The payments were processed. And every single one traced back to a medical equipment company registered to a shell corporation with 3 layers of legal obfuscation that would have taken a forensic accountant weeks to unwind. Kickbacks. That's what this was. Dr. Mercer orders Phantom supplies under the rehabilitation program's name. The equipment company delivers them nowhere, or to a warehouse, or nowhere at all. The equipment company cuts a check to a holding company that shares a P.O. box with Dr. Mercer's investment portfolio. Patient gets billed. Insurance pays. Nobody questions it because it's all on paper. It's all pristine. It's all documented. And it's all a lie. She'd handled millions in black budget ops funding. She'd seen contractor fraud in the field that would make a civilian auditor weep. But this was different. This was meticulous. This was the kind of operation someone spent months planning. Years perfecting. And Marcus Webb was the test case. Rachel looked at the clock again. 11:47. She needed to move faster, but moving fast was how people got caught. She photographed the rest of the billing records with methodical precision. Each image was insurance. Each image was proof. But proof of fraud wasn't proof of harm. Her Pentagon liaison had been clear: Mercer's actions needed to escalate beyond financial theft into active medical endangerment before the military could move. That's when she found the reassignment order. It was buried in the ICU staffing log, a single line that Dr. Mercer had initialed at 6 p.m. Dr. Hayes, cardiothoracic, overnight rotation reassigned to Beaufort Memorial per Mercer directive. Staffing coverage adequate with Tel Aviv on standby. Except Tel Aviv was a first-year resident who'd never performed an emergency thoracotomy outside of simulation. And Beaufort Memorial was 35 miles away. 40 minutes in a car at midnight. An hour in an ambulance with traffic. Rachel's breath came slow and measured, the way it always did when the situation became clear. Not panic. Not fear. Clarity. This was the moment in Kandahar when her forward observer had radioed that the landing zone was hot, and she'd realized with absolute certainty that the next 30 minutes would either kill them or make them soldiers. She felt the same thing now. Mercer hadn't just ordered phantom treatments. He'd removed the surgeon who could perform emergency intervention if something went wrong. He'd done it surgically. Strategically. The kind of move that looked like scheduling optimization if anyone asked questions. Understaffed overnight? No. Just unfortunate timing. The cardiothoracic surgeon happened to be needed elsewhere. Except it wasn't happening. It was planned. Rachel moved to the equipment room next, the one where the crash carts lived. 12 grey metal carts lined the wall like waiting soldiers. She knew this room. She'd worked enough night shifts to know exactly which cart belonged to which unit. Room for 12 was ICU primary. She pulled the 412 cart into the light. The thoracotomy tray was missing. The slot was empty. Surgical scissors. Retractors. The chest spreader. The satin sky clamp. All of it. Gone. And beneath the empty slot, Dr. Mercer's handwriting on a supply log, thoracotomy kit removed for sterilization per maintenance request 11/3. Replacement pending. November 3rd. That was 4 days ago. Which meant the replacement wasn't pending. The replacement was never coming. Rachel looked at the other carts. Cart 405. Cart 403. Cart 401. They all had their thoracotomy trays. Fully stocked. But the cart for room for 12, the room where Marcus Webb lay with 3 shattered vertebrae and weakened lung tissue from his original blast injury, was empty by design. She photographed the empty slot. Her hand stayed steady. That was the military part. The part that had learned to observe catastrophe from a distance without flinching. To see the trap and file it away and wait for the exact moment to spring it. But underneath that, something else moved. Something that remembered holding Marcus's hand after he lost his hearing in Kandahar. Something that remembered his jaw clenching as they fitted him for hearing aids that didn't work and would never work because the damage was too deep. Something that remembered him saying, through an interpreter because his voice had become a stranger to him, that at least he was alive, at least he could still save people, at least he still had his hands. The time was 12:03 a.m. Rachel didn't have a phone call to make. Didn't have a liaison to contact. She had a window of time that was shrinking by the minute, and she had a choice that was narrowing to a single point. She could gather more evidence. She could document the conspiracy with forensic certainty. She could preserve her cover, stay in position, complete the full mission profile, and watch Dr. Mercer's fraud get untangled in depositions and court filings months from now. Or she could prepare for the thing that was about to happen. Because something was about to happen. She could feel it the way people who've survived war feel the air pressure change before an explosion. The way birds go silent before a storm. Marcus's vital signs had been trending wrong all evening, blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing, oxygen saturation drifting down in micro increments that nobody else was tracking because nobody else was paying attention to a deaf veteran in a private room as a cautionary tale. Rachel closed the crash cart. Stepped away from the equipment room. Moved back into the ICU with her shoulders set at exactly the angle that let her appear relaxed, exhausted, just another nurse finishing her charting before the swing shift ended at 1 a.m. She checked on Marcus's room from the outside. The door was closed. The lights were dim. His monitor showed normal sinus rhythm at 78 beats per minute. Good. Stable. Fine. For now. She knew what Mercer had constructed. She knew how it would fail. She knew the exact sequence of events because she'd seen it before, not in a hospital, but in a combat hospital in Loga province where a medic had made a calculated decision and she'd been there to see what happened next. A patient with a history of blast injury. Weakened lung tissue. Healing but fragile, like ceramic that had already cracked. Something, stress, inflammation, a sudden shift in position, could cause air to leak into the pleural space. Tension pneumothorax. The lung collapses. The heart shifts. Blood pressure drops. Without a needle decompression or a thoracotomy, it becomes fatal in minutes. And if the thoracotomy tray is missing, if the surgeon is across 3 counties, if you're alone with a deaf patient who can't call for help because his monitor is silent and his call button is out of reach, then you have to make a choice about who gets to survive. Rachel checked the clock in her scrubs pocket. 12:44 a.m. She reached into her personal bag and felt the familiar weight of her EMT knife, the one with the custom handle and the faded unit patch sewn into the sheath. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Her name was beneath it in letters so small they were almost invisible. She had 13 minutes before the shift change. 13 minutes before Dr. Mercer made his rounds. 13 minutes to position herself where she needed to be when the monitors started screaming. The cardiac alarm pulled her from the nurse's station at 2:03 a.m. One continuous wail, high-pitched, electric, cutting through the white noise of the ICU like a bullet through silence. Rachel moved before her conscious mind registered which room. Room for 12. The numbers on her mental map had already plotted the route. She pushed through the door and saw Marcus Webb's chest was silent. No rise, no fall. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, pumping air into lungs that weren't expanding, and the monitor above his bed screamed in protest, a flat green line with a single chaotic spike, then nothing. His lips had already begun to darken. His skin had that grey-white pallor she'd seen in field tents in Kandahar when the body began its shutdown sequence. Rachel's hands moved on their own. She was already reaching for the crash cart before the first nurse appeared in the doorway, already knowing what she wouldn't find. The thoracotomy tray was gone. The surgical instruments that should have been there, the rib spreader, the chest retractors, the vascular clamps, removed with surgical precision. Dr. Mercer's precision. Code Blue, room for 12, Rachel called into the intercom, her voice steady as ice water. The charge nurse was already running. Tension pneumothorax. Surgical emergency. She looked at her hands. At Marcus's chest. At the oxygen saturation reading on the monitor that was dropping like a stone, it had been 94% 3 hours ago. Now the sensor wasn't registering. His body had already shut down the peripheral circulation. The clock was counting down in a language she knew fluently. 45 seconds until brain death. Maybe 90 if she was lucky. The crash cart arrived. She watched the resident fumble for equipment, watched him reach for the thoracotomy tray slot and find it empty, watched his face go slack with confusion. "Where's?" "Gone," Rachel said. "All of it." Dr. Mercer reassigned the thoracic surgeon to County Memorial 20 minutes ago, one of the nurses said, her voice rising into panic. "He said we didn't need backup coverage tonight." "I thought it was strange but—" Rachel understood the math. 3 seconds of calculation, the on-call cardiothoracic surgeon was 47 minutes away by car. The next nearest hospital was an hour's drive. By then Marcus would be dead. His brain would be dead. His heart would be muscle that had stopped pumping. Let him die. Preserve the mission. The assignment was Operation Steel Angel. The objective was intelligence gathering, not heroics. She had her orders in her pocket and a Pentagon liaison waiting for the evidence she'd photographed. She had her career, her clearance, her future as a military intelligence officer waiting on the other side of this hospital wall. She looked at Marcus Webb. She looked at his deaf ears that had heard mortars and helicopters and the sound of his own blood pouring into his lungs. She looked at the kid who'd taken her place as combat medic when her shoulder wound made her right arm unreliable in the field. She looked at the Marine who'd held his position for 11 hours when his convoy was ambushed while she called in extraction coordinates. She pulled her EMT shears from her pocket. Not the shears. The knife. The blade was 3.5 inches of surgical steel, carried through 3 combat tours, sharpened on a whetstone at 2 a.m. in tents that smelled like diesel fuel and human pain. She'd used it to cut tape, cut clothing, cut through the wall of a femoral artery once when a .223 round had punched through a Marine's inner thigh. She'd used it to cut sutures and field dressings and the green webbing that held tourniquets in place. She'd never used it like this. Not since Kandahar. Not since the forward surgical tent. "Step back," Rachel said. Her voice had dropped into the register she reserved for combat medicine. The resident backed away from the bed immediately. The nurses moved. The room cleared in a way that told them something had shifted, that the temp nurse had become something else entirely. Rachel pulled on sterile gloves. The latex snapped against her wrists like a weapon being loaded. She found the 4th intercostal space with her fingers. The anatomical landmarks were written into her muscle memory in a language older than words. Anterior axillary line. The space between the ribs. She marked the spot with her thumb, just below the nipple line, where the chest wall was thinnest. Pain is information. Pain is data. The knife bit through skin with the small resistance of cutting through wet leather. No hesitation. No tremor. Just the clean slice of a blade through tissue, epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous fat, the intercostal fascia separating muscle from the space where the lungs lived. Blood pooled. Her hands were red to the wrists. Good. Blood meant she was in the right place. She widened the incision with her fingers, her hand steady as surgical instruments, and the pressure released with an audible hiss, the sound of air that had been crushing Marcus's lungs escaping into the atmosphere like a gasp. The tension pneumothorax had created a one-way valve, sucking air into his chest cavity with every mechanical breath the ventilator forced into him. Killing him. Collapsing his right lung with the efficiency of a strangler's hands. "Hand me a chest tube." 14 French if you have it, Rachel said. Someone was already moving, already understanding that she knew what she was doing. "Get me 2 1,000 milliliter bags of normal saline running wide open. Push access. Prepare for massive transfusion protocol." She opened the wound wider, her hand spreading the ribs apart manually, and the anatomy of Marcus Webb's chest cavity opened in front of her like a map she'd learned by heart in a place where medicine was a knife and intuition was all you had. The right lung was collapsed, airless, a useless sack of tissue. The left side was pushing toward the midline, being crushed by pressure and blood and the physical weight of a body shutting down. She reached inside. Her hand found his heart. It wasn't beating. It was fibrillating, quivering uselessly, performing movements that generated no pulse, no pressure, no life. Her palm pressed against the cardiac wall and she began to compress it manually, squeezing the muscle against the rigid structure of his chest cavity, counting the compressions in the rhythm she'd learned from a Marine colonel who taught her cardiac massage in a tent lit by chemical glow sticks while artillery walked closer with each detonation. 1, 2, 3. Compress. The heart stutter under her palms. 4, 5, 6. She was massaging a dead man's heart back to life with the same hands that had held it where he was broken. 7, 8, 9. The monitor was still flat. The room was silent except for the ventilator and the sound of her own breathing, controlled and precise. 20 seconds of compression. 30. 40. The heart felt like cold meat in her hand, like something that had already made its decision to stop. "Come on, Webb," she whispered. "Come on." 50 seconds. Her forearm was burning with the effort of squeezing with enough force to move blood through his coronary arteries, to push oxygen to his brain, to convince his body that it wasn't dead yet. 60. 70. The monitor twitched. It was the smallest movement, one blip of electricity that could have been artifact, could have been error, could have been the last gasp of a dying system. But she felt it. She felt his heart skip under her hand, felt the muscle begin to contract on its own, felt the biological machinery wake up from its shutdown sequence. 107 seconds. The monitor showed sinus rhythm. A single beat. Then another. Then a proper cadence, 70 beats per minute, steady and alive and real. "Good," Rachel said. "That's good, Marcus." His lungs were still collapsed. His chest cavity was open. She needed a proper chest tube, proper surgical care, proper equipment. But his heart was beating. The oxygen saturation monitor that had been flatlined was now climbing, 71%, 78%, 84%. His blood was getting oxygen again. His brain was getting blood again. The window for death was closing. She pulled on the chest tube materials, threading the equipment through the wound with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, in rain, under fire. The tube went into the pleural space with a small resistance. Connected to the one-way valve. Secured. Air began to escape from around the tube in small, steady breaths. "BP is back," someone said. 88/56. Rising. The trauma team was on its way. But for now, in this moment at 2:11 a.m., Marcus Webb's heart was beating in Rachel's hand and his lungs were expanding with each breath, and the emergency that had seemed impossible was becoming survivable. Her hands were steady. They didn't shake. They didn't fail. They remembered exactly what they'd learned in a place where stopping meant death. She maintained the chest tube drainage, monitored his vital signs climbing back toward normal, and waited for the surgical team. By 2:45 a.m., the thoracic surgeon had Marcus in an operating room with a proper surgical team. By 3:15 a.m., Dr. Mercer had Rachel's termination papers ready on his desk. She found her in the administrative office on the second floor, still in her bloody scrubs, still wearing the expression of someone who'd made a choice with her eyes wide open. He didn't ask what had happened in room 412. He didn't need to. The word had spread through St. Michael's in real time, the temp nurse who'd performed an unauthorized field thoracotomy on a patient, who'd violated a dozen protocols, who'd stolen surgical equipment from the crash cart and used a personal knife to cut into a human being. Unauthorized surgical procedures, Dr. Mercer said, his voice as calm as a surgeon delivering a diagnosis. His phone was on the desk between them. Theft of medical equipment. Reckless endangerment of a patient. I've already called the state nursing board, the hospital's legal department, and the medical licensing authority. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just removed a threat to his operation. Your nursing license is suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you from the building immediately. Rachel picked up her cardboard box from the floor. Inside was a cracked World's Best Mom mug from a Mother's Day gift exchange she'd won at a staff party. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot that Carlos had given her 3 years ago. A photograph of her in desert camouflage holding a younger Marcus Webb after his promotion ceremony, both of them grinning with the recklessness of people who believed they'd live forever. She walked out of St. Michael's at 4:07 a.m. with the rain soaking through her jacket, soaking through to the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining. The insignia of the 160th saw that she'd carried through every assignment for 16 years. The nursing job was over. The mission had been detonated. But some things mattered more than orders. She was still standing at the bus stop in Savannah Rain when the taxi pulled up and her 16-year-old son Carlos jumped out of the back seat, his eyes wide and his hands shaking as he clutched a shadow box against his chest. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "They need to know who you are." Rachel stood in Marcus's doorway with her cardboard box still in her hands when Dr. Mercer tried to leave the room. He moved fast, his white coat catching air like a sail, but 2 figures in dark suits blocked the threshold before his shoes touched the corridor tile. FBI credentials appeared, held steady at eye level. The lead agent's voice came out flat and procedural, the kind of calm that meant someone had already made decisions 3 levels above this moment. "Dr. Mercer, we have questions about your billing practices and your financial arrangements with medical equipment vendors." The tablet in the agent's hand showed spreadsheets scrolling past, line after line of phantom charges, inflated orders, names of suppliers that didn't exist on any legitimate registry. Mercer's face went the color of old bone. The Pentagon liaison stepped forward, a woman with colonel's bearing and eyes like a vault door. "Captain Torres's initial background check, standard protocol for any staff working near military patients, triggered automated flags when her classified service record intersected with Marcus Webb's VA benefits." She paused, letting that sink in. "We've been monitoring this facility's financial transactions for 5 weeks. Captain Torres's reports accelerated our timeline by approximately 30 days. The FBI agent scrolled deeper. Inflated equipment orders from a supplier owned by your brother-in-law. Phantom rehabilitation sessions. Treatments billed but never performed. Medications requisitioned and never administered." Each word landed like a gavel. "You've defrauded the VA out of $840,000 across 17 patients over 3 years. Mercer's lawyer arrived within 20 minutes, but the case was already collapsing like a building with its load-bearing walls removed. In the billing office downstairs, FBI agents downloaded evidence from servers while hospital administrators watched the screens in silence, their faces reflecting the glow of spreadsheets that proved negligence, greed, and something darker, a man who had engineered the conditions for a patient to die. Rachel watched from the hallway. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their electric song, and she stood motionless in the middle of it all, her cardboard box containing everything she'd brought to St. Michael's, a cracked World's Best Mom mug from a Mother's Day 7 years ago when Carlos still thought his mother was just a nurse. A dying succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf for 3 months, watering it every morning even though everyone said it was finished. A photograph of her and a younger Marcus Webb after his promotion ceremony in the Hindu Kush, both of them standing in front of a flag, both of them believing they had their whole lives ahead of them before the mountains took his hearing and his spine and nearly took everything else. The CEO suspended Mercer immediately. Hospital legal counsel drafted a statement. By morning, news vans surrounded St. Michael's like vultures on a highway. By afternoon, the state medical board opened an emergency investigation. The trauma surgeon who treated Marcus after Rachel's intervention, a man named Chen, 43 years old, with hands that had done 12,000 surgeries, provided a deposition that turned the case inside out. Captain Torres's procedure was textbook combat medicine, Dr. Chen stated, his voice steady as a metronome. She saved his life using field techniques under impossible conditions. Any trained military medic would have done the same. He paused, and his next words came out clipped and precise. The question is why our crash cart was missing the proper equipment and why our thoracic surgeon was reassigned during a critical shift. The FBI investigated both. They pulled the work orders showing the thoracotomy tray removed from the crash cart at 11:27 p.m., signed by Dr. Mercer. They found the reassignment of Dr. Patterson to County Hospital that same evening, dated 10:33 p.m., also initiated by Mercer. They traced the timeline back 48 hours and found that Mercer made these moves immediately after Rachel requested Marcus's complete treatment records. The lead FBI agent wrote in his report, Subject Mercer took premeditated action to ensure patient Marcus Webb would not survive a medical emergency, removing resources necessary for his care and eliminating specialist coverage necessary for intervention. Subject Torres's unauthorized field procedure prevented what would have been classified as medical homicide resulting from gross negligence and intentional harm. Within 48 hours, FBI agents escorted Dr. Mercer from his home in handcuffs, the man who had once held scalpels now walking in front of news cameras, his hands cuffed behind his back, his lawyer already calculating whether to negotiate federal fraud charges or plead out. The metal clinks of the handcuffs sounded like punctuation marks on his career. Rachel was back in Marcus's room when Mercer made his final attempt. His lawyer had called the hospital, claiming that Rachel's unauthorized field thoracotomy proved she was unstable and dangerous, that her actions were as much a violation as his negligence. He was trying to muddy the water, to suggest equivalence between saving a life and nearly allowing one to be murdered through systematic medical fraud. But Dr. Chen had already provided his deposition, had already stated under penalty of perjury that Rachel's procedure was precisely what combat medicine demanded. The trauma surgery literature backed him up. The military medical handbook had a section on field thoracotomies performed with whatever tools were available, including combat knives, under conditions where delay meant death. Rachel knew all of it. She'd lived it in the Hindu Kush. She'd taught it to medics in the field. She'd seen it work and seen it fail, and she knew the difference between someone who understood the weight of those choices and someone who made choices based on billing codes and equipment kickbacks. Marcus signed from his hospital bed, his hands moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to speak without sound. His fingers formed the letters slowly, "Thank you." Rachel's hands came up, muscle memory and years moving her fingers into the response she'd been waiting to give since the moment she recognized him in room for 12. No Marine left behind. The words hung in the air between them, spelled out in the language that required no voice, no machines, nothing but intention and hands steady enough to communicate across a silence that most people never learn to navigate. Carlos watched from the doorway, still holding the shadow box. His mother turned, and for the first time in 48 hours, something in her face shifted, not a crack, not a fracture, but a deliberate opening, the way a captain lowers a weapon when the battle is over. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," she said. Carlos shook his head, his 16-year-old voice carrying a maturity that made her throat tighten. "You taught me what matters, Mom." Some things you don't need to say. A general entered the room, 2 stars catching the light on his shoulders, his uniform crisp as a knife edge. Behind him came the Pentagon liaison. They were no longer trying to move quietly through St. Michael's. They didn't need to. The classification wall had fallen. The mission was complete. The general approached Rachel and saluted, a gesture reserved for officers, his right hand rising to his brow in a motion that acknowledged her rank, her service, her sacrifice. Captain Torres, Operation Steel Angel is concluding in Savannah. However, your cover may have been compromised, but the mission just expanded. We're establishing a new Pentagon task force investigating medical fraud at VA facilities nationwide, using the protocols you've pioneered here. We need you to head it. Rachel accepted the orders without hesitation. When do I report? Next Monday. Fort Meade. The general handed her a sealed envelope. Full briefing package. Your new team is already assembled. 3 investigators, 2 forensic accountants, and a liaison to the VA Inspector General's office. You proved the Steel Angel protocol works. Now we're scaling it. Dr. Mercer's lawyer negotiated for 18 months, but the evidence was overwhelming, federal fraud charges carrying a maximum of 40 years, medical license revoked permanently, $2,300,000 in restitution to the VA. He accepted a plea deal that included 10 years of supervised probation, community service, and a requirement that he work driving a medical supply van for the very VA system he'd defrauded. The judge read the sentence with a tone that suggested she'd considered recommending the maximum. Dr. Mercer, you will spend the next decade delivering equipment to veterans, a daily reminder of what you failed to provide them when they were in your care. Rachel pinned her captain's bars back onto her uniform jacket, the insignia catching light with a shine that came from burnish and precision. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, still there, still bearing the call sign Reaper Actual, was now visible as she turned the jacket right side out. She stood in full dress uniform for the first time in 3 months, and the transformation was absolute. Every trace of the deferential temp nurse was gone. In her place stood a woman with authority built on survival, on choices made in darkness, on the kind of competence that didn't need to announce itself. Mark a sign from his hospital bed one final time, his fingers moving through the air like someone casting a spell. Hindu Kush. You told me a captain fights for those who can't fight for themselves. Rachel's hands came up automatically, the response written in her bones. Still do. The screen faded on Rachel walking out of St. Michael's in full dress uniform, Carlos beside her carrying the shadow box, the morning sun catching her bronze star. The hospital doors slid open without resistance. Outside, the Savannah humidity hit like warm breath, and she breathed it in, the smell of rain on pavement and magnolia blossoms and the sea 3 miles away. She was heading toward something new now, toward a mission that would take her across the country, toward other Marines in other hospitals, toward veterans whose names she didn't know yet but whose lives would depend on the same unwavering principle that had brought her here, no one left behind. If you've witnessed medical fraud, billing irregularities, or patient harm in your own healthcare facility, report it. The state medical boards, the FBI, and the VA Inspector General's office depend on people who speak up. And if you know someone in healthcare who's fighting quietly for their patients, someone whose loyalty you can't quite explain, whose presence feels more solid than it should, maybe they're fighting harder battles than you'll ever know. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes. Like this video if you believe in accountability. Comment below, what would you have done in Rachel's position?